afternoon is made up of Tebele Lutuli, who is the Director of Policy and Legislation at Business Leadership South Africa, Busi Mavuso, who is the Chief Executive Officer at EWC, Themba Nonochungu, who's the Director of the Free Market Foundation, joining us from Cape Town, and Martin van Staden, who is the Head of Legal at the Free Market Foundation. To those of you who are watching online, please send your comments and questions, and I'll do my best to pose them to the panel throughout the course of the discussion. I think this is an important discussion, and as many views as possible would be welcomed. The issue of land is a contentious one in South Africa. Across the political discourse and commentary, it evokes very visceral emotions. Before we begin, I'd just like the CEO of Business Leadership South Africa, Busi Mavuso, to say a few words, and then we'll get into the discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for making the time to join us as we have this very critical conversation today around this very contentious issue of the land expropriation without compensation. And we have chosen to theme the topic today around land expropriation without compensation, turning a disaster into an opportunity. I think let's acknowledge that we are having this conversation during a very critical time in our country. COVID-19 has exacerbated our economic crisis, and it has intensified the hardships of the South African economy. And it is interesting for me how this crisis has just exposed just how unequal we are as a society and just how fractured our democracy is. I think many of you would have seen a WhatsApp message that was sent by some Indian doctor at the beginning of the lockdown around March. And he was talking about how the ways to ward off the virus seem to be accessible only to the affluent. He was talking about how, he said this, by the way, in the context of India, but when I looked at it in the South African context, it really resonated. He was talking about how we are told to constantly wash our hands, which assumes that you have running water. And yet we know in the South African context that a lot of our people don't have access to running water. We are told that we need to constantly sanitize our hands, which assumes that you have the money to buy the sanitizer in the first place. And yet we know that a lot of our people are still struggling with satisfying the basic needs in as far as the Maslow's hierarchy of needs is concerned. We're told that we need to stay at home for social distancing purposes, and yet a lot of our people don't live in houses big enough to can social distance. It was interesting how the lockdown in this country was actually very ineffective, especially in townships, precisely because people live in circumstances where you have to wake up and go out there. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about land expropriation, how we turn this disaster into an opportunity. You know, the biggest ticking time bomb for me in this country is just how unequal our society is. And this whole issue of inequality, and it has definitely been intensified by 3 million people having lost their jobs during this lockdown. We have a serious social justice conundrum in this country that needs addressing. And in my view, if we start tackling the land issue, then I think we are halfway there in terms of starting to deal with the triple challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. You see, the land issue for me is not an economic process. It is a social justice process. And it therefore baffles me why 25 years into our democracy, we have done very little to deal with it as a country. And if you were to pause and look at how do we sustainably deal with this issue, how do we sustainably change things around in our country to start dealing with the triple challenges, I think you would agree that structural reform is central to that. And when we talk about structural reform, as we jump up and down as business in terms of government accelerating the issue of structural reform, central to that structural reform is definitely the land reform issue and the clarity around Section 25 of the Constitution. And maybe at this point, allow me to submit that BLSA acknowledges the legacy of property ownership and the fact that it continues to be an obstacle for transformation, for economic growth, and for human development. Our unique history as a country of dispossession and the current triple challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment require strengthening and a spreading of property ownership. So, to this end, the BLSA definitely supports the pursuing of an accelerated land reform project, which includes expropriation. But what we don't agree with is that you need to deal with this issue by amending the Constitution. Because I think if you look at the Constitution, you will see that it certainly says that the Constitution and the law may allow for expropriation without compensation in exceptional circumstances. That's number one. And number two, it says that the law will allow for the payment of compensation that is below market value where public interest outweighs the property interests at stake. So if the Constitution already allows for it, the question we ought to be asking around Section 25 is, what are we amending? And whatever it is that we're amending, to what end are we amending it? And at this point, let's agree that the reason that we have done very little in terms of addressing this issue in this country is precisely because there is no political will in terms of addressing the issue. This is not a constitutional inadequacy. The reason why we haven't addressed this, it's got nothing to do with the constitutional. It is rather an administration failure by government. And the reason why I say that is because we have only managed to restitute 7% of the land. So if we thought this issue was critical to the social justice agenda that we are pursuing as a country, surely we should have done more in as far as restitution is concerned. We wouldn't be sitting in a country where the land claims court is understaffed with only one permanent judge, and you have all the other judges that are rotating, which therefore means that the decisions in as far as the land claims court is concerned continue to change, and there is no stability in as far as what we're doing in that space is concerned. I'm definitely looking forward to this discussion. I'm looking forward to it because I'm hoping that the experts that we have in the room, I'm definitely no expert when it comes to this, I'm hoping that the experts are going to shed light around how do we turn this disaster into an opportunity as a country, and what the amendment of Section 25 of the Constitution ought to be, and more importantly, what are some of those non-negotiables that we're actually going to have to look at in amending Section 25 of the Constitution. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to stop there, Madam Facilitator, and hand over back to you, and let's allow the discussion to continue. Thank you very much for joining us, and looking forward to this critical discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Busi. So, recognizing the injustices of the past, as you've touched on, the South African government has tried to address the land question through land reform, which has been described by Tembegang Kwaitobi in his capacity as an acting land claims judge as an unmitigated disaster. The South African government published a draft land expropriation bill for public comment in December 2019. The bill provides that where land is expropriated for the purposes of land reform, the amount of compensation may be null. So let's get into this debate. I'm going to start with you. The Centre for Development and Enterprise made a submission to Parliament regarding the review of Section 25 of the Constitution with the support of BLA, saying, and I quote, "Changing the Constitution will not address the major land reform challenges," some of those that Busi has spoken about. What will?
So I think our CEO was quite clear that trying to amend legislation before dealing with the core administrative issues such as inefficient funding, inadequate training, as well as corruption that prevailed within the process before, is a little bit like putting the cart before the horse. So we need to address those issues before we try and fiddle with legislation. Changing the constitution, which already permits for land expropriation without compensation, to further make it clarify that you can expropriate land without compensation is really neither here nor there unless those core issues are addressed.
Mm-hmm. Martin, you share the belief about not needing to change the constitution and believe that expropriation should only be done under quite narrow circumstances, including only apartheid dispossession where the current owner knows about it.
Yeah, that's true. So the reason why the constitution shouldn't be changed, as has been pointed out by now, is that it already provides for land reform quite generously, specifically section 25, 5, 6 and 7 say, among other things, that people with insecure tenure resulting from apartheid land law should have their tenure secured. People who have had their land dispossessed, or their descendants, of course, should be able to claim that land back, and that process has been inefficient. And simply that government must strengthen property rights. That is the point of Section 25. Government must ensure that South Africa is a property rights respecting state on the international arena. The Expropriation Without Compensation Bill, the Constitution 18th Amendment Bill, goes directly against this. It conflicts with our founding values. Section 1A of the Constitution says that South Africa is committed to the advancement of human rights and freedoms. And what government is doing is specifically undermining an established and vested right to compensation. But of course, there are circumstances where property can be expropriated without compensation without undermining property rights. And it's very important for us to recognize those. And that could be, for instance, when land has been abandoned. That does happen. I don't think it's particularly common, but it does happen. Abandoned land, particularly, for instance, in high crime areas. We've seen that in Johannesburg to an extent. This isn't agricultural land, of course, but that property has been abandoned and can simply be taken. But the more important aspect which you alluded to, which I've written on, is where land has been dispossessed by the apartheid regime. And of course it's been given by that regime to its political friends and to family and so forth, and it's been descended after many years, many decades. Then it becomes a factual question. Does the current person who owns but holds that land, do they know that this land was dispossessed from someone who is the legitimate owner? And if that is true, then they are a mollified, malicious possessor of that land, and it should be, it can legitimately be taken from them without compensation and given to the legitimate owner. However, I think that's probably rare. I think most people who own land today probably bought the land on the open market, and they wouldn't know the history of the acquisition of that property, meaning they've based their livelihoods and they've built businesses with the good faith assumption that they are the true owners of that land. And I think that in those circumstances, as a matter of justice, of fairness, in a constitutional democracy like ours, the government must pay compensation to those people when the land is expropriated. I think that it almost goes without saying. We're not saying the land shouldn't be expropriated, because if it's not yours, it's not yours. It needs to be given to those who it belongs to. But compensation should be payable under those circumstances.
Okay. Busi, let's follow up on Martin's point about what type of properties should be dealt with. Can you give us clarity on BLSA's views on how and what type of property should be expropriated?
You know, I think Martin has actually made a good point around, before we even look at expropriating properties that have got valid ownership, as it were, there is a lot in my mind, before you even go to expropriation, there is a lot in my view that government currently sits with, that they are not utilizing, you know, to its fullest, that actually needs to be dealt with, as it were. And whatever it is that has actually been expropriated has not been distributed, as it were. So government also, if you were to ask government today, you know, where are you sitting in as far as the land audit is concerned, and how are you actually planning on dealing with that which has already been expropriated and that is sitting at your coffers. You would get different answers, from everyone that you speak with, from a government perspective. So unless and until there is clarity in terms of, what does government own, what does government need, and what is it that can actually be distributed, to allow for what we need to achieve in as far as what the expropriation is intended for, then we have no business actually causing the ructions that we have caused as a country, and therefore putting the investment, at stake, by talking about expropriation without compensation. Because let's agree that the reason why our investment initiatives, even when we have employed investment envoys to go and try and seek and try and get investment into the country, the reason why those efforts have been in vain is precisely because of the uncertainty around some of the critical policy areas. And the biggest one has been that, of Section 25 of the Constitution in as far as expropriation without compensation is concerned. Because forget about trying to get investors into the country when you cannot guarantee them property rights. Forget about trying to get investors into the country when they don't know that what they are bringing in, they'll be able to actually take away, when they leave the country. And I think that is the critical issue, to say our house is not in order, so we have no business, actually creating the uncertainty that we have created. But I think the most important point for me as well is that this whole issue around expropriation without compensation, if you were to ask me, I really think that this is government hiding behind their thumb. Remember, for the past 25 years, we had agreed, or rather they had agreed, in trying to get votes, that one of the critical things that we're going to be addressing is the issue of land. And now 25 years later, you have done nothing about it. You had better come up with a good reason in terms of why have you not moved. So to try to give people a plausible reason in terms of why you have not done anything, you have to create some legitimate excuse, which in this case is to say that the Constitution is not clear in terms of how we need to expropriate without compensation. And I think to Martin's point, the Constitution is not, there is no confusion when it comes to the Constitution. So we are actually itching where it is not, or we are scratching where it is not itching, here as a country. I think we just need to have an honest conversation to say, what is it that needs to be done? And more importantly, why have we not done it? Because now there is a lull, there is a stalemate in as far as the land issue is concerned, because it's going to take forever, to actually get to the amendment of Section 25, and an amendment which will satisfy the investors and every constituency, not only in this country, but from an international perspective, in terms of how we are going to move from this Section 25 of the Constitution.
Let's continue with the point of an external perspective. We go to Cape Town, where Themba Noluchungu is. You credited as one of the people who pushed for the property rights clause in South Africa's constitution. The land reform process that culminated in that decision included input from other African countries now. What's the lesson that you believe that we can learn as we're having this discussion around expropriation from other countries on our continent?
Okay, let me just state up front. But if anyone or any government wants to destroy an economy anywhere in the world, especially in the South African context where we are contemplating with a constitutional amendment that's going to make it permissible for property to be expropriated. If you want to destroy an economy, implement expropriation of land, which broadly means property without compensation. Then you're going to wreck the economy. Then you will precipitate capital flight. Because the thing is, investors, when they invest in any market, they want clarity, they want guarantee, they want legal surety, legal certainty that their properties will not be expropriated by a government. This is a dangerous, dangerous thing that we are contemplating in this country. And the other point that really concerns me is that, and we're seeing this happening, and that you see the rhetoric, you listen to the rhetoric, and you can see that as to who is targeted in terms of this EWC proposal. It is the whites. But legally speaking, if this was to be implemented, as is the case in terms of what is being proposed, everyone will be vulnerable, irrespective of their color. And so blacks would also be vulnerable because they would not have their property rights being protected at all. Because constitutionally, the government would be mandated to just confiscate, expropriate whatever property belonging to whoever might be owning that property. And the other thing to consider is a couple of elections down the line, we do not know what sort of government will be in place. They could use this amendment to the Constitution to the detriment of some targeted, identified group or ethnic group, whatever the case might be. And it would also be the case that once implemented, there could be some lower government official who could just utilize this mandate to just confiscate some land somewhere. Then there is the other concern, and this is the fact that we've been observing since before 1994, just before the democratic dispensation kicked in, we've been observing the dying embers of racism. And now this we have seen that this issue of the EWC expropriation of land without compensation is rekindling racial tensions. We see that happening all the time. So these are the things that concern me. This is why 2 years ago we decided to hold a conference in partnership with the Atlas Network in Johannesburg. And we got input from various think tanks, mostly from the African continent and other countries, on just simply this issue of expropriation of land without compensation. We had invited those think tanks that made an input to present the case, either for or against, on the basis of objective empirical evidence. I'm going to take you through very, very briefly through some of the highlights in terms of the input. For example, Petrus Sito, in his personal capacity, he had the following words to say: the bad thing about expropriation without compensation is that it has made South Africa a sick country. On the one hand, we have nervous and scared landowners. Okay, that's very, very brief. And I can move on to the next input from Egypt. These are think tanks. And in Egypt, the input was, and I highlight the major essence of their input, the idea of land itself has been related to honor, ancestry, family, and the right to live itself. Then there is the input, which is also very important, from Linda Kavuka, representing a think tank that is based in Kenya. She had the following to say: the kind of politics intended by the proposed expropriation without compensation law cannot have a happy ending for South Africa. It will be a great pity and a big blow to the entire continent to watch the star of Africa fall from its glory and dive into indignity and also the destruction of the economy. So there is a strong case against the EWC in case that we might go ahead in terms of implementing it. That's based on evidence, empirical evidence, objective evidence. So the input involved over 12 think tanks. And also there was an input, this is also very important, from Venezuelans, 2 inputs. And there was also another input from Professor Yuri Maltsev. Now, Professor Yuri Maltsev, at some stage, he was the economic advisor to President Mikhail Gorbachev. So these are the inputs that really have to be taken cognizance of, especially by those who are bent on getting the EWC to be implemented. That is expropriation of land without compensation. It is a disastrous path that's being contemplated at a time when the economy is contracting. I am sorry to say it, but I have to admit it, that if we really, really implement the EWC constitutional amendment, it's going to be disastrous. We are going to have problems that we had never foreseen. Now, another input was from the Zimbabwean think tank that's known as Comaliso. And here, Rejoice Ngwenya says that the path that's being contemplated will lead inevitably to what is being experienced in Zimbabwe. A neighbor to the north of us. We see what the consequences have been. We know that over 4 million Zimbabweans fled their country, and they are in this country. And Zimbabwe, having been the breadbasket of the African continent, it is now a begging bowl throughout the world and wanting all sorts of subsidies or financial injections and, and all sorts of things. And the unemployment rate in that country is so alarming. We're talking about above 60% of the people being unemployed in that country. We must not contemplate, we must not pursue this idea of expropriation of land without compensation.
Thank you for that input from Cape Town. Busi, there's this fear, and when it comes down to it, people always use Zimbabwe as an example. The chairperson of the ad hoc committee, Dr. Matsole Moseka from the ANC, said, we're not going to be like Zimbabwe because we're in a multi-party democracy. They just had ZANU-PF. We have many other opposition parties that hold each other in account. There's been consensus around this discussion that there needs to be more things done before we proceed with that. When it comes to the governing party, as well as the third largest party, they've expressed their wish for expropriation without compensation, which means there's almost a sense of certainty that the parliamentary process will go ahead. No one's suddenly going to stop and go, there was this webinar and we need to change our minds.
True.
So what's the role of business then in how land reform will happen and in this discussion that's taking place there?
Yeah. So I guess my colleagues have best articulated it to say that I think in doing whatever it is that we need to do, let's ensure, and Martin puts it nicely, that we are a property rights respecting state, especially in the international arena. Because in terms of where we are as a country, we are well on our way and we are working towards how do we position ourselves as the investment destination in the continent? How do we take back our rightful place in as far as attracting foreign direct investment in particular? So if you are not going to address, the issue of property rights in particular, then unfortunately you are not going to achieve what you need to achieve. But I guess I don't know if we can ignore what happened in Zimbabwe, because as much as we're a multi-party democracy state, I don't think that we are all agreed in terms of how Section 25 of the Constitution or how expropriation without compensation or how the land reform agenda needs to be addressed. Because if you listen to the EFF, they are definitely taking you to the Zimbabwe route, right? And I think there is some in the ANC who are actually, leftist, to that extent. So you also have, are sitting in an environment where this ANC, being an ANC-led government, is actually very powerful. If you look at just how many, from an electorate perspective, how much power they command, you can see that if the battle were to be lost, allow me to say, between the good or the bad, or between the leftist and the rightist in the ANC, then this thing can easily run away with us. So I don't think that it was properly thought through, but we also know that it wouldn't have been thought through because it was just a ploy, to actually try and move the blame from why we as this ANC-led government have not done what we were supposed to do. So I don't think that we need to relax, as a country. I don't think that business can actually, leave this process to the parliamentarians and say that they've got this covered, because we know they don't. There are a lot of decisions that have been taken in this country that are not pro-SA, that are not pro-business, that are not pro-working towards establishing a conducive environment in this country. We also know that we have actually been very lethargic in terms of ensuring that the issue of policy certainty and policy stability, is attained in this country. So I think the role of business in this case would be to have to work with the government to the extent that they allow us to say that what is it that we as business would respond to? What are some of the non-negotiables that are going to have to be present in the amendment of the Section 25? Because to your point, let's agree that we have lost the battle, that we're not going to amend Section 25. It is going to be amended. But I guess let's therefore organize ourselves to say that what the amendment ought to look like, and to what extent do we address the issue of property rights in particular.
Can I add to that?
Sure, you can.
Before you go to Martin. So when we talk about what the constitutional amendment should look like, it is to deal with, it should be limited to land, first of all, and it should retain the power of the courts to determine what just and equitable compensation is, including nil compensation in extreme circumstances. What the bill does right now is it applies to land and improvements on land, which is quite problematic. And our submission is that improvements of land should be dealt with in the normal way of just and equitable compensation for what those improvements on land are and should be. And to Temba's point around the fear and the worries that anybody could come take anybody's land and we are all subject to it. I think the fact that both the Expropriation Bill and the 18th Constitutional Amendment Bill still deal with the centrality of the courts at the end of the day to decide what is just compensation sort of detracts from that worry and fear that it's not going to be an arbitrary government decision. You still have redress to the courts as a last option if and when necessary to prevent and protect yourself from that sort of arbitrary decision making. Of course, it's not nice to have to go to court to defend your property, and one wouldn't want to, but it really isn't going to be a random selection of property that will then be subject to expropriation without compensation. And the Expropriation Bill also clearly lists the sorts of properties that will be subject to EWC. Martin has spoken about a few of the properties, and Sisbusi has also spoken about state-owned land that is underutilized and unused rural and urban land that has been abandoned, or property and buildings that have been abandoned. But the problem with that, with the Expropriation Bill specifically, is that that list right now is open-ended. So they've got a few examples, but it's not closed. And our preference would be for that list to be closed so that everybody has that policy certainty to know that this is the policy, this is the types of property, and nothing else that are going to be or could possibly subject to expropriation without compensation. An open list sort of then leaves that uncertainty and door open for any other sort of property to be subject to that, which is quite concerning to us. And the role of business, other than to speak about property rights and enforce the property rights, especially how property rights are key to investment, I think business has come to the party to work and collaborate with government. And through NEDLAC, I've been to numerous processes where businesses and business organizations in the agriculture sector have put together models as to how this transfer can be done and how emerging black farmers can be tutored and mentored by existing farmers before the transfer takes place. I know BASA at some point was working at putting together some funding models, and I know there were a number of mining houses as well that made their property that wasn't necessary for mining anymore open to agricultural purposes. So we have been coming to the party as business in the best way possible to assist the government with its aim of redistributing land to those that need it. It's just the policy certainty that is required and not leaving it open-ended that will then boost the investment that we require.
Martin, I just want you to pick up on a point that both Debele and Busi have made around the courts. Your concern is that there's going to be a perceived loss of power of the courts to Parliament, and there's going to also be an erosion of the values of human rights if we proceed as we're going to.
Yeah, so firstly, the problem with the amendment bill itself is that it delegates to Parliament an unrestrained discretion to determine under which circumstances land could be expropriated without compensation. And Tebele points out correctly that that is contained in the expropriation bill. So viewers should be mindful that there is a difference between the constitutional amendment and the expropriation bill, which is ordinary legislation that Parliament can change by a 50% plus one majority, which the government comfortably controls. The Constitution can only be amended from 2/3 majority upwards. So that's the first problem. Now, the Free Market Foundation's preference is that the list currently in the expropriation bill must be put in the amendment bill. So that takes the parliamentary discretion away, and it fixes those circumstances under which land could be expropriated without compensation. So state land, abandoned land, that list that we've gone through. That is our preference, because that then takes, it almost takes expropriation without compensation out of the political realm and it vests it in the judicial realm. Because then the courts will be able to determine in each case whether this is in fact a case that adheres to the closed list in the Constitution, and whether a nil expropriation is just and equitable, taking into account the values of our constitutional order. For as long as it's in the political realm where Parliament can simply amend the legislation, then today it's abandoned land, tomorrow it's land owned by a specific tribe, tomorrow, the day after that, it's land owned by homosexuals. We don't know where it could go. It's a terrible idea to leave EWC in the political realm. But if we want EWC, which I stress we should not want, but if we do want it, it needs to be in the judicial realm. So in that case, the courts need to be able to make the determination, and the governing party has announced, as I said earlier, that it wants to take that away from the courts. It wants to change the amendment bill before it is enacted to say that no, the executive government will decide. The courts will still have a rationality review role. If you think the government was being irrational, then you can go to the courts and say this isn't right, but the courts won't decide firstly and finally. That's something we also need to avoid. The power needs to reside with the courts, period. No government discretion whatsoever. And if that does not happen, then our argument is that expropriation without compensation, even if it's adopted into the Constitution, will still per se be unconstitutional. And that is because of Section 1 of the Constitution. It's a very overlooked provision, unfortunately, but it says that South Africa is an open and democratic state founded on the values of, I believe it says there, freedom, equality, and dignity. And that Section 1A says that specifically, and that we are all about advancing human rights and freedoms. Now, Section 1 can only be changed with a 75% majority. That's a supermajority that has nothing to do with amending the Bill of Rights. And that means that these values are important. These values are overridingly important. And if we pursue a path where land can willy-nilly be taken by someone in the executive government, where Parliament can just decide from day to day, hey, we're going to amend the expropriation bill to say that land and this land, and maybe not just land anymore, maybe some bank accounts, retirement funds, then we're no longer engaged in advancing human rights and freedoms. Then we're very consciously engaged in exactly what the apartheid regime was doing, and that was pursuing very narrow, very bigoted political agendas. And it would be a sad day indeed if our constitution, our highest law, no longer protects South Africans against that type of government conduct. And Themba made this point earlier, and I think it's overlooked, that at the end of the day, the poorest and most vulnerable South Africans will be the ones who suffer most. Wealthy South Africans who currently are said to own this massive majority of land, they still have access to lawyers. They can fight whatever government does to expropriate their land for years in court. And if they lose, they'll say, well, okay, goodbye, we're taking our money and we're leaving. Poor South Africans have been subject to expropriation without compensation in this country forever, and still are, because they, by and large, do not have title deeds to their property. They still live in shanty towns, which they do not own. They don't own the shanty house they live in, and in townships where the municipal government still owns in title the land that they own, live on. And a 1991 law, the Upgrading of Land Tenure Rights Act, says that in fact the people who live in those townships are the owners, and they should receive their title deeds. But government has been extremely lax in actually doing that. And that means that up to now, these people still don't have any proof of ownership. And government can come and say, yeah, you need to leave now. They'll say, but this is our property. And they'll say, prove it. And they can't, because they don't have a title deed. So as we sit here right now before the amendment bill is enacted, expropriation without compensation exists in South Africa. And it's directed at the poorest and most vulnerable South Africans. And if we adopt the amendment, it's going to formalize that. We shouldn't go down that route. We should stick with the values that our Constitution declares as supreme, and that includes property rights. Many naysayers would say no, but property rights are very fundamental to your prosperity, to your dignity, to your right to equality, your ability to provide for yourself. And we will make a massive mistake by undoing 26 years of imperfect but good progress towards the ideal of having a prosperous, freedom and rights-based society if we do this recklessly.
We have heard a lot of consensus on this issue, a lot of fear about what could happen. Temba, I'm going to come to you now. One of the counters to the fear around expropriation without compensation is people quoting the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, saying that there has been a sort of expropriation before and there hasn't been chaos. So talk to us about what you believe the specific consequences of expropriation without compensation are more, and to follow up on the points that have just been made in Johannesburg.
I'll hold back, and
go.
then when you call me up, I'll articulate my very important point on the EWC. Who's responding to this? Martin, are you?
No, it was directed
We are
at
asking you to respond to it. Sorry, we just lost your sound for a moment there.
The question, maybe ask it again.
Or I'll tell you what what has happened to the mining sector. There's a lesson to be learned there. In that, the fact that one can say the mining sector has been contracting, to my knowledge. That is what I've come to learn. And what has happened there is that there has been some capital flight as a result of the mining sector being to some degree nationalized, as one could put it. So there is that lesson to be. There's the other story, the other side of the coin in terms of the point that you are making, Madam Facilitator. But here's this point that I want to emphasize here. Coming back to the EWC itself. The explicit, frank view of the Free Market Foundation is, first of all, that the battle is not lost against the EWC, that we're still going to fight it because it would be disastrous for the country. And the other thing is the Free Market Foundation's standpoint is that this should not be implemented. There should not be a constitutional amendment that entertains EWC. Instead, if any amendment is contemplated, it should be to reinforce the property rights clause as it is. Finish and clear. That is the Free Market Foundation's viewpoint. However, in the same breath, let me just mention that there are credible and feasible alternatives to EWC. Let me just briefly express them. One of them would be that has been alluded to some degree in the beginning. One is that The government has acknowledged, the government, it is known, has a lot of superfluous land that it owns. That land should be parceled out to indigent families on a freehold title basis. So a family occupies a plot only in terms, in the context of the superfluous land. It's very easy to implement, very easy. It is also feasible. But the thing is, for me personally, that the plots of land should not be parceled out on a racial basis. There should be identified the poor people, the indigent people, indigent families, so to speak, on a non-racial basis. There are poor whites, there are poor colors, there are poor, Indians and so forth. So target those people to be beneficiaries of the land that will be disseminated amongst the families. It's feasible, it can happen overnight, and there is no political will on the part of government. Then the other proposal that comes from the Free Market Foundation is that if you're looking at state-owned enterprises, what you should do is to transfer those state-owned enterprises to the private sector, invite companies that might have an interest in them, and those companies could be in discussion with some poor people or families to be part of that company. So they hold a certain percentage in terms of a stake in those privatized SOEs, state-owned enterprises. Now, I know the word privatized has a negative connotation, but the point is, leave things to the private sector and they will demonstrate that they can deliver. Now, then deliver returns on that investment. It will be risky, but I guarantee that they will deliver returns on that. Now, the thing is, this very same measure was implemented in what was Czechoslovakia at that time, which is now the Czech Republic, and also in the Slovak Republic. In 1991, I was there when almost all the state-owned government during the communist era were handed over to the people in terms of a voucher system. So people, everybody in that country had a voucher that reflected what stake they had in whatever company state-owned previously, and whichever company and so on, and they would choose. And so, you know what? 8 years later, when I went back to that country, there was such an incredible change, such an incredible economic transformation by just simply implementing this proposal, this idea. Now, Václav Klaus, who was the prime minister at the time, had that, addressing him that we were part of. He had said, don't believe governments when they say things cannot be done overnight, especially when you have political parties in power articulating that sentiment. That is what he said. And in that country, that measure was implemented. Why can't it be done here? Instead of just tolerating and throwing money at these SOE abysses, where the money, taxpayers' money, gets lost, then there is another measure that the government could implement, and that would be, if you look at all government-owned houses, where most black people live in, the government could just simply hand over ownership on a free title legal basis of those houses that families are living in as tenants. So they become then the owners of that. You know what? Hernando de Soto, in his book, The Mystery of Capital, mentions the fact that property that is not legally titled is meaningless is not significant at all in economics. But once it is legalized in terms of ownership, meaning a freehold title, then overnight it becomes an asset. It becomes an economic asset. And you have a situation then where people who had been poor, who have been have-nots, become haves, and they become the stakeholders in the context of the wider economy of the country. these measures can be implemented almost overnight.
Okay.
These are credible, feasible measures that the government should be embarking upon as a matter of urgency, a matter of priority, and then we would see things changing in this country. But no, no, no. There should not be expropriation of land without compensation. That should not be in the Constitution. It doesn't belong in the Constitution. We should not have this. There are other credible, feasible alternatives to EWC that should be taken into cognizance. Now, then the other thing is, we have a book that I've alluded to that comprises inputs from various countries by their think tanks. And they all echo the same view, and that is, do not implement EWC legally, constitutionally in South Africa because of these negative consequences in our countries. The title of the book, by the way, is Security of Property Rights, a critical response to the expropriation of land without compensation. Now, let me end off just this part by quoting the words of the Spanish-American philosopher, George Santayana. He said, and I quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." So we need to learn from empirical evidence that is non-ideological, that is objective, to guide us in terms of what should be done, and it is quite clear as to what should be done. We should not do anything that will negate or diminish the protection of property rights in the Constitution.
Thanks for that input. We are taking questions from the panelists, not the panelists. We are taking questions for the panelists from people who are watching online. If you have any question, please direct it specifically. If you'd like it to be answered by a specific person, or if you've just got a comment, we will be taking those and posing them to the panelists now. So I've got one from a viewer who's asking, Martin, what about residential property on a bond? Will homeowners continue to pay a bond on a property that the government could expropriate?
Yeah, so there has been a lot of confusion around that. I think some banks and some businesses at some point said that, no, we'll still expect you to pay your bond, even if your property is expropriated without compensation. Yes, that is a massive problem. It's clearly in South Africa something that the law isn't used to, that we haven't seen before, and it's obviously going to be massively economically detrimental, because I cannot foresee that any reasonable South African who has their property expropriated without compensation, or even with compensation, is going to continue paying their bond come hell or high water. It's simply not going to happen. So these businesses that think that's the case, it's a fantasy. And to an extent, I don't think the courts are going to come to their assistance either. So this is something that should be communicated to government, to say that, listen, this is not only going to have a very direct effect on investment, but established businesses in South Africa stand to lose out big time, especially the financial houses. So yeah, that's absolutely another big reason why we should avoid it, and the uncertainty around that makes it all the worse.
There's a question that's been posed to all the panelists, so whoever feels best placed to answer it can. What do you think of prescribed assets as a tool used to fund expropriation? Anybody for the taking?
Yeah, I'll take it if you want. Okay, yeah, no, I think it's a terrible idea for all the same reasons. It should leave people's property alone. This is even more in your face than expropriation without compensation, because with EWC you almost have that issue of saying we need to look at the history of the property to see what happened here, what's the justice surrounding what we should do with the property. But when it comes to my retirement savings, my bank accounts, money that I have earned, that ordinary hard-working South African of whatever race, whatever class has worked hard for their entire lives and saved for. I mean, the only just answer to that is to leave their bloody money alone, especially if you want to put that into companies and state vanity projects that have been shown without exception to be inefficient, to fuel corruption. If that's the plan, then obviously the answer is no. So to fund SAA, to fund ESCOM, even to fund land restitution, because I think South Africans pay more than enough in taxes to fund government paying compensation to people in restitution claims. So no, avoid prescribed assets for all the same reasons that you avoid EWC.
This is a question from N-Team Tembu. I know that Temba touched on this just now, but how should title deeds be acquired for those state-owned properties now and under EWC?
Okay, I can tell you, respond very briefly to that, and that is the Free Market Foundation has a project which is its flagship, and this is the Kyadalum Property Titling Project. Now, what we do as the Free Market Foundation is that we've got on board companies that are conveyancing firms, legal conveyancing firms, getting them on board. And we, in the context of this project, we at the same time make approaches to the private sector and individuals to sponsor the titling of title deeds. And so companies and individuals decide on the basis of their financial capacities as to how many of these households that are owned by the government they can sponsor. And unfortunately, and the good thing with some of our partners from the conveyancing firms, they've come on board on the basis of lowering their standard conveyancing fees by more than They charge about a sixth of the standard conveyancing fee in order to make this possible. And we liaise with the municipal entities and the municipalities, and we say to them, these properties are owned by you. Now, could we come into some kind of arrangement whereby you can identify which properties you have on your database, and we will come up with a sponsorship for that we will facilitate, or we have facilitated. And then what happens is, when all is said and done, then the initiative culminates in people actually having freehold title deeds. So it is feasible. The Free Market Foundation has shown the way, but then the government could really make it very easy if they could just simply overnight, just simply declare that all the people who are legitimate tenants of the houses that are owned by the government, especially at municipality government level, are now going to be the legal freehold title holders of those units. It can be done. It just requires political will. That's what it requires. So it can be done. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks. We've got another question here. Anyone can answer it. What do you think of spatial planning and the Land Use Management Act in the context of land reform?
So I guess maybe I can come in. I think let's agree that one of the biggest failures that we actually have as a country is precisely that of spatial planning. You know, you're sitting in a country with all its problems and with the social justice issues that we're facing, where the majority of the citizens of this country still continue to spend about 60% of their income just on transport, you know, to go to work in the main. And I think if you talk about how are we supposed to implement some of the reform, you know, to try and level the playing field, as it were, same with the issue of the land reform issue. This is where you realize how government has actually failed to address some of the fundamentals and some of the basics in as far as this is concerned. So it is no wonder when you look at such things why we have overtaken Brazil in 2018 to be one of the most unequal societies in the world. Let's agree that we have scored a lot of own goals as a country. Let's agree that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that could have been tackled, that could have been addressed, that should have been prioritized. But because of the lack of political will, because our focus as a country and as a government are not where it should be, we are sitting in this situation where we're facing these triple challenges and where we have as the biggest ticking time bomb the issue of inequality. So there is a lot of talk, I know, around government corners in as far as creating, I guess, smart cities and but I guess I don't know if it is not a little too late, but I guess better late than never, right? So I think the issue of spatial planning, I think, is one of those really that South Africa has not done anything about. I don't even want to say we have done little about. We really haven't moved, you know, so we are yet to actually really focus on how do we adequately address and how do we sustainably address the issue of spatial planning.
If I could just...
Sorry, I need to, I'm trying to run as much as possible as close to time. There are very specific questions for both of you, so I'd like you to answer them. If we have time at the end, we can come back and comment. Debele, have you reviewed court cases? How would you interpret just and equitable compensation?
So, just and equitable compensation is something that Section 36 is quite clear about. And it's depending on the particular circumstances of the particular property that is being expropriated without compensation. And it looks at all the circumstances, such as Martin has phrased, as such as how the historical context of the land, how it was acquired, the current use of the land, and is there even a mortgage bond, etc., on the land, and then that's then how the just and equitable determination is made.
Martin, there's a question here for you. Why do you see the bill as taking away the powers of the courts? Is it not taking out the judiciary in policy-making decisions and following up on the separation of powers doctrine?
Yeah, so the bill currently does not take away powers from the courts. The bill as it currently stands, I think, quite properly vests the power in the courts. But what I was referring to earlier was that I believe it was the chairman or the co-chairperson of the committee drafting the amendment or engaging with the public on it, saying that they don't want that to stay that way. They want to replace that provision. So they want to update the bill, or downgrade the bill rather, to one where the courts don't occupy that position anymore, but rather the executive. The reasons for this are, of course, the notion that the executive is quicker and etc. But of course, that's nonsense. On the policy aspect, I think we need to be very careful by taking rights vested in South Africans in the Constitution and saying that government can just deal with this as a matter of policy. I think that the Constitution says you have these rights as South Africans, and because the Constitutional Court specifically and the courts in general are the guardians of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, we need to say rights have nothing to do with policy. The courts need to decide whether your rights are being violated or respected.
Okay. Then there's another question for you. Will EWC affect residential property? Can it be taken without compensation?
I would say, as things currently stand, yes. So government simply needs to. Was it for me or for
yes,
today?
yes,
oh, for me. Sorry. If government makes an argument that this is for land reform purposes and expropriates residential property, then it can get away with that, because, as Tebele pointed out, the bill refers to improvements on land as well, and that could include houses, etc. It's going to get difficult for government the further it moves into cities, for instance, but it's very conceivable on the current language of the land that it can, at some level, expropriate residential property without compensation.
Deborah, do you have any follow-up points on that question about will EWC affect residential property and can it be taken without compensation?
I agree with Martin's reading on it, and like I said previously, the fact that it refers to improvements on land, that obviously means houses and buildings on the land, which then can possibly be expropriated without compensation if government makes the case for it. And I was quite clear that our submission is that improvements should be left out of the EWC equation altogether, and that should be subject to the normal just and equitable test as to what reasonable compensation is for those improvements on the property.
We are still taking questions from people who are watching this webinar live. You can also ask if you want a specific panelist to address any issues around expropriation without compensation, any questions, or also send us your comments on what you think of the discussion so far. I know a little bit later on, we've spent a large part of the discussion speaking about the potential consequences and what has gone wrong. But I think in any discussion, there needs to be also a look forward to what are the best case scenarios. Debbie, I know you've touched on this as well, and how best expropriation and the broader issue of land in South Africa can work from a business perspective, from a think tank perspective. So I'm going to wait and see if there are any more questions coming in. Temba, while we wait, I don't know if there's any comments you'd like to make on any of the submissions the panelists have made so far.
Well, I'd like to comment on the point that you've raised in the course of posing your question, the statement that you just made, and that is, we talk about potential consequences of EWC being implemented. These are not potential consequences. These would be inevitable consequences based on empirical evidence in terms of expropriation of property, of land, having been implemented in various countries as reflected in the book that I have mentioned. And that's the reality. These are not potential consequences. We are seeing something happening right now before even the EWC is constitutionally made permissible and the government is mandated to go about confiscating people's properties. We are seeing people leaving the country. We're seeing people, there is a flight of capital. It is happening right now. Right now, it is happening right now. We're losing so a great deal of expertise, and with people who've been involved in the agricultural sector, we're losing all these people to neighboring countries like Mozambique and also further beyond the African continent. It is happening right now. Right now, we need to take cognizance of this, and especially the policymakers must not stick their heads in the sand, because this is happening right now. It should be taken cognizance of. And all this is saying is that, look, do not even discuss any further the idea of implementing the proposal as it is right now. And so the thing to do is just simply to not entertain the idea of making these constitutional amendments so as to make it permissible for government to confiscate property. Right. It will lead us to a Zimbabwean situation. It will inevitably, this is not a potential consequence, it's proven that it will be inevitable. This is what's going to happen. Flight of capital. At that moment, before the ink is dry in terms of the constitutional amendment being enacted, before the ink is dry on that, we will have such a flight of capital that the policymakers' heads will just spin. It's okay. Predictable.
Take some more questions.
It is foreseeable. It is conceivable. It will happen. It is inevitable.
Thank you for that very robust commentary. There's another question here. Shouldn't land reform be a mandate of Economic Development Ministry instead of the politicized land affairs and agriculture ministries, given EWC has become a toss-up between livelihood and land? Any of the panelists can take that question.
I think my colleagues are more qualified to answer this than I am. But I think I'd like to think that precisely because you are dealing with addressing the social injustices that we have in this country, because let's not forget why we are dealing or why we have this issue on the table in the first place. We are trying to correct what the 1913 Land Act did, right? So I think in trying to right those wrongs, it definitely has contributed to the economic dispossession, of the majority of the citizens of this country. So maybe, just maybe, as much as, and I'm really torn with this one, because as much as I am of the view that this is not an economic process, but a social justice process, but maybe, to give it the attention that it needs to be given, maybe it needs to be accelerated to the economic process. Because if you agree that the triple challenges that we have in this country of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, are precisely as the result of the economic injustice that we have in this country. So it could be, it could well be that this issue of land reform might need to be moved to a ministry, that is more central to our economy, and to a ministry that will probably maybe give it the attention that it requires. Because at the moment, let's agree that it is not given the right attention, after everything that we have spoken about around just the how the land courts and the land ministry is currently equipped and resourced, as it were.
Okay. There's a comment coming in from Andrew Barker. The state has failed dismally on spatial planning.
Yeah.
Lots of talk, but lack of implementation by pushing greenfield instead of brownfield development. There's also another comment from Hoboko Motiba, who says land access without livelihood is an injustice to human dignity. Communal land rights regime continues to demonstrate this injustice. There's a question here. I think it's not quite within what we're talking about, but everything is related, of course. Where do we stand on the formation of a state bank?
Geez, hopefully we're very far away from creating another state-owned enterprise. So let's put that out of our minds.
I think my question to that would be, to what end? What are we trying to achieve with a state bank? You've got all the DFIs, you've got the land bank, you've got there used to be a TIBA bank. I don't know if it still exists. So I think probably maybe if we were to properly define the problem statement, to say this state bank will achieve X, there's the post bank, there is, and the list is endless. The government currently sits with more than 743 SOEs. What is it that this state bank would achieve that the commercial banks, the DFIs, and everything else in between that the government owns is not currently achieving? So I think if we were to clearly identify that problem statement, then we would see what it is that we're trying to solve for, and let's come up with a rational solution. I don't think that we need to be going with these headlines, around state bank, and they are also talking about a state pharmaceutical company, and it would be disastrous if South Africa were to think, and this government in particular, were to think of creating yet another SOE when they are failing at the current 743 that they have, where all of them are dysfunctional, all of them.
Okay, we're going to see if we've got questions just before we wrap up. I know there is another question coming in. I'm just waiting for it. Temba, you've got a comment to make there in Cape Town?
I'd like to mention that I support fully the statement that's just been made. The thing is, what is the government's interest in running a business? Government should not run a business. Government's responsibility should be to bring about a policy environment that's going to be conducive to the proliferation of businesses, as a consequence of which wealth will be created, as a consequence of which employment will be generated. Government should just remove unnecessary legislative, regulatory impediment of enterprise, thereby making it easy for people to go into business. That is all that the government should do in the economic arena. Government should not be involved in running a business itself, because inherently Government is not able to do that. And the reason being the fact that the people in government, if that business, so-called business, were to fail, they would not be personally impacted. They would still ride into the sunset with saddlebags full of money, with all their fringe benefits. So the thing is, if it's in the private sector, everyone is at risk. And so they do their utmost best to ensure that their business thrives, that the business grows, that the business realizes on the investment. Investment in terms of labor, investment in terms of capital, that's the bottom line. That's the bottom line. Government should not think of running a business of whatever nature. A colleague of ours used to mention over the years that based on empirical evidence, which we all should learn from, that when things are in the hands of government, they are in a hell of a state.
We have a few more questions coming in. I'd like us to now wrap up this part of the discussion, but there is a comment from Andrew Barker again saying, surely expropriation in urban areas to promote brownfield development will help to address spatial inequalities. Views from any of the panelists. Of course, he's referring to buildings developed on sites previously used for industrial or commercial purposes. He's saying that perhaps can assist. And then another question is, what would be government's justification to perpetuate homelessness by expropriating homes? And the final question is, where is government in the process of EWC? What's their next step?
Okay, so to the first comment, I mean, definitely it can address the spatial issue, but it depends again on which land and which property is used to do that. And like we have said, there's a lot of state-owned land that is vacant that could be used to address that. But what's important then is to ensure that such land is close to services and close to metropolitan centers where people do work. So like Sisbusi said, people aren't spending so much money on transport getting to their work and offices, and obviously the land grabs that we are seeing as well. You know, the land conversation is mostly centered around agricultural property, but there is a clear need for urban property and urban settlement, and that is what people are crying out for. So that should be addressed, and again, it depends which sort of property is used to address that shortcoming.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, I think urban land reform, as it were, is far more important than rural land reform. That is where South Africans want to be. They want to be around opportunities, recreation. They want to be around people. That's the global trend. That's the South African trend. But I don't think expropriation without compensation should even feature in that conversation. We should be about giving title deeds to people who are suffering currently without ownership in urban areas. And where land has been abandoned, for instance, of course, take that and use it for far more productive purposes, definitely not in state ownership, but in private ownership. So I think absolutely focus on urban land reform. As to the second question, I think the question about what could government's justification be, I think the fundamental point to remember is that we don't know. We can never know what a future government would do. We can see throughout history what power-hungry politicians can come up with. Some of the worst instances of tyrannical government in history happened in the last 100 years in Europe and in Africa. So it could be anything. They could say that some ethnic group needs more living space in a specific city. So if you happen to not be a member of that group, then you need to be out and someone else needs to go and live in your house. That's possible. I'm not saying this government would do that, but if we amend the constitution to allow government as an institution to do it, we have absolutely no idea what's going to happen in 50 years and 100 years under that same power. So we need to be very, very careful. But I know that we said that this webcast was going to be about turning a disaster into an opportunity, and we haven't really said much about that. But if I could just say that what Themba said earlier, that if we want to amend the constitution, we need to do it to strengthen property rights, especially in the post-COVID context. And that would mean that we need to we should direct the government far more explicitly than the Constitution currently does to ensure tenure security, to ensure that it does not own any unproductive or underutilized property, and that whenever it engages in any type of land reform, and this is fundamental, that government itself must never be the owner. Never, ever, ever. The owner must always be a politically unconnected, ordinary South African. A business, a person, never government, never government's friends. And I think that is how we could approach government with this idea and say, okay, you want EWC, you want to amend the constitution, you have your back against the wall, you've nailed your colors to the mast. There is a way to do that, and there is a way to do that by strengthening property rights and saying we are a property rights respecting constitutional democracy on the world stage. And then you need to do these things, define strictly, and really build it around restitution and not around nationalization.
So, Debele, if you could just add your solutions for how we turn EWC from a disaster to an opportunity as we wrap up, and give solutions to the land reform issue.
So in order to do that, I'd like to go back to what has previously been stated by the President numerous times and by the ANC itself as well in one of its documents when it started talking about EWC. And it said for a successful land reform program to take place, future investment in the economy must not be undermined. Damage must not be caused to agricultural production and food security, and other sectors of the economy must not be harmed. And those three points have been stated again and again, but obviously it's vague. What does that mean? What needs to take place now is, in conjunction with business who have ideas as to how you implement a land reform program without undermining investment and not damaging food production and agricultural production, finalize the current legislation, have that input from business, and do it in a manner where the public consultation process takes place properly, and do it in a manner that is transparent, because we all want to bring solutions to the table and come to the party with solutions and implement land reform in a way that doesn't impact the economy in the way that the ANC itself has numerously stated that it shouldn't affect the economy. Like we've said, we are in a post-COVID environment, or actually current COVID environment, where our economy is suffering even more than it was. So the collaborative aspect becomes even more important than it was before, to make sure that we do it and we do this in the right way.
Okay. We're going to go back to Cape Town to just get a closing statement from you. If you can just tell us what's the right way, as Debele has said, to do land reform.
Yeah, well, the thing is, I think it was mentioned, I think it was voiced from the very beginning, that government could have been able to implement credible, positive land reforms without touching the constitution, without doing that. So there needs to be pressure exerted on the government to reconsider its idea of the EWC proposal and think in terms of what can be done, which is what the government should have done a long time ago and has failed dismally. But anyway, let me just again emphasize, explain about the government's superfluous land that it has at its disposal, parcel out to indigent family on a non-racial basis. Now, what the government could do, having that idea in mind, is that the government could make it its responsibility to construct the infrastructure, so there are roads, so there is street lighting, and so there is water that is acceptable, running water that is. The government has enough resources to deliver that. It is a measure that can be implemented in rural areas, And so it would not be necessarily targeting, say, the metropolitan areas, because the government thought that could not be feasible in rural areas. It is feasible. It can happen. That is one of the measures that the government must take cognizance of.
I'm going to ask you to please pause it there so that we continue running on time. I would like to hand over to Ms. Mavuso to give us her solutions as well as wrap up the webinar for us. Thank you so much to everybody who was watching and sent in their comments and their questions to us. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I think maybe let me also, as I close, thank our esteemed panelists around giving us their views in as far as this contentious and very critical issue is concerned. I think Themba said a very important statement during his opening remarks around the fact that if any government wants to destroy an economy, then let them implement expropriation without compensation. And I thought that was very telling, and I think that really resonated. Let's agree that what we are contemplating and the manner in which we are contemplating it is a very dangerous space that we actually want to enter into. And I think it really heightens the policy uncertainty that we're currently sitting with in this country, which therefore means that our journey and our path of trying to attract investment is therefore going to be a failed initiative, precisely because of how we are choosing to deal with this matter. Yes, the issue of land is a very sensitive one, precisely because of our issue of dispossession, and government has an obligation to ensure that we traverse this very carefully, as it were. And I think let's agree to Martin's point that to achieve this issue and to deal with it correctly, we need to be a property rights respecting state in the international arena. And as we move towards amending Section 25 of the Constitution, let's do so without undermining property rights. My colleague Debele talks about the clarity that we need to have as a country around what land means, and let's only limit the expropriation to land, because let's agree that if you're going to be talking about expropriation of land, and if you increase it to assets, then you start talking about a whole lot of other issues that are going to put a lot of people in a very uncomfortable position. And let's ensure that as we talk about land, we exclude the issue of improvements to land, because that is not supposed to be contained therein. I think we've been very clear as well in terms of shedding light on this issue. The panelists are talking about how we need to ensure that the courts are the ones who make the determination and not politics, because if we allow politics to run away with this, then unfortunately it is going to be put in a position where the process will not be just and it will not be a fair process. So it's been a very insightful discussion, and I think we have achieved, in my view, what we needed to achieve. We have spoken about what are some of the things that need to be done to accelerate the process. We have spoken about how we need to accelerate the giving of the title deeds. We have spoken about how we actually need to identify what land means in this instance and what type of land are we talking about. We have identified the circumstances under which land needs to be expropriated. And I think if government were to take all of this into account, I don't think that the amending of Section 25, and I know we are all stressing that it doesn't need to be amended, but let's also agree that that ship has sailed. So in amending Section 25, I think government really needs to bring business closer to the process so that we can be able to guide, the discussion, and we can have an amendment that is actually not going to be detrimental to what we are trying to achieve as a country, which is to ensure that the environment in which we're operating is a conducive environment. But I think lastly, I'm hoping that soon, as the president promised a week ago, that he's going to be coming to the country with an economic reform agenda, or rather an economic policy that is meant to change the economic trajectory of our country. I'm hoping that Section 25 is going to be enlisted therein as one of the critical issues that South Africa needs to address as we move towards changing our economic trajectory, as we move towards stabilizing our economic situation, and as we move towards ensuring that we can regain our position as the investment destination in the African continent. If we fail to address the land issue, if we fail to address what the amendment of Section 25 is going to mean, then I'm worried that South Africa might as well be on its way to being another failed African state. Thank you.
Thank you.